I was at that age where being left alone felt like the ultimate freedom. I had just turned 13, and my parents finally started trusting me to stay overnight by myself. The rules were simple: don't leave the house, and no one comes over. Honestly, I didn't mind. There was something thrilling about having the place to myself, with no one around to scold me for blasting my music or video games at full volume. The night was perfect. It had started to rain, and soon enough, it escalated into a full-blown thunderstorm. I sat under the porch for a bit, watching the storm as it lit up the sky. There's always been something about thunderstorms that makes staying inside feel cozier. After a while, I decided to move my Xbox from my room to the downstairs den. The den had my dad's massive flat-screen TV, complete with a Bose sound system, an upgrade that was usually off-limits unless they weren't home. It was only a half flight down from the living room and opened directly to the backyard. That night, I was deep into a game of Black Ops, chatting with my friend Cody online. My old headset made it so I could only hear the voices of other players, which added to the immersion. For a 13-year-old, it was the perfect night, until it wasn't. Around 9 p.m., the doorbell rang. I quickly told Cody and he, of course, suggested I check it out. My first thought was that my parents had returned early, but they had keys, so why ring the bell? I paused the game, found a safe spot to hide, and cautiously went upstairs. "Who's there?" I asked. Immediately, I regretted speaking. A man's voice replied from the other side. "I need to use a phone." I froze. Something about the situation felt off. I didn't respond. Instead, I hurried back downstairs, but I knew I'd already made a mistake by revealing I was home. I told Cody what had happened, and his immediate response was, "Yo, that's messed up." He agreed I should stay put and not answer the door. Moments later, the doorbell rang again. This time, I ignored it. Silence followed, and eventually, I convinced myself that whoever it was had left. I relaxed, letting my guard down, and got lost in my game once more. But then I heard it. A faint noise to my right. I glanced over, and there, slipping inside through the back door, was a tall figure, definitely not my dad. It was a complete stranger. My body reacted before my mind could. I dropped the controller and bolted for the office. The headset cord snapped out of the controller as I sprinted. Just as I slammed the office door behind me, the handle rattled violently. The man on the other side was trying to get in. The office had 2 exits, one leading back to the den and another to the garage. My only chance was the garage. But for a moment, I stood frozen, barely breathing, listening to the furious pounding on the door. Seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. The man's voice broke the silence, low and insistent at first. "Kid, let me use the phone. I just need to get out of the rain." Then his voice shifted, growing more agitated, his knocking more forceful. Soon, he was yelling, "Open the damn door, you little __." He pounded so hard, it felt like the door might give way at any moment. I had no choice. I darted for the garage, pressing the button to lift the door. It moved agonizingly slow, every creak and groan echoing louder than it should have. I prayed he couldn't hear it. As soon as the gap was wide enough, I slid underneath and dashed through the storm, my heart pounding in my ears. I sprinted toward my neighbor Julian's house, barely thinking, just running. I used to play with his dog, Copper, when I was younger, and I hoped he'd be home. As I reached their door, Copper's barking was the only thing I could hear over the rain. Julian answered, and I practically fell into his arms, breathless, telling him everything. His wife emerged from the kitchen, her face shifting from confusion to concern as they realized what was happening. Julian called the police, and we waited, what felt like an eternity, before the flashing lights finally arrived. The officers questioned me, asking if I knew the man. I didn't. They searched the house, and after a tense few minutes, they emerged with him in cuffs. He was wild, shouting incoherently that it was his house, that I was his son. It was obvious he was drunk, high, or just plain unhinged. They took him away, and later I found out his name, John McCarty. He was charged with criminal trespass. But the thought of him knowing where I lived, it didn't exactly help me sleep better at night. Even though he was just a random guy who happened upon our house, I couldn't shake the feeling that one day he'd be out, and I'd still be here. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine something truly terrifying would happen to me. I always thought of myself as just another ordinary person, leading an uneventful life. The type where anything even remotely strange would seem extraordinary. That's why I always felt comfortable watching creepypastas and true horror stories on YouTube. It was entertainment. It felt safe. But after what happened to me, those stories now hit a little too close to home. It was one of those nights, sometime around 4 a.m., I think. The rest of the house was sound asleep, my mom, along with both of my grandparents. For the past couple of months, thunderstorms had been a regular occurrence, sometimes happening every week. That night was no different. This particular storm had started earlier in the evening. I've always loved watching thunderstorms, especially late at night when the flashes of lightning seem to cut through the darkness. But the wind has always unsettled me. It has this eerie ability to go from a soft, whispering breeze to a howling force in a heartbeat, and something about that switch has always made me uneasy. That night, though, the storm was one of the worst in a long time. It sounded like pebbles were being hurled against my window, but I didn't mind. I was actually enjoying the noise while scrolling through Reddit, like usual. Then, without any warning, the power went out. Darkness swallowed the room instantly. It was unsettling, but nothing I couldn't handle. My phone was still charged, and I had data, so I kept browsing. After a while, I felt sleep creeping in, so I set my phone on the bedside table and turned over, trying to get comfortable. I must have drifted off pretty quickly because the next thing I remember is the heavy rain against the window giving way to an eerie stillness. The silence was broken by a knock, a sound so out of place it jolted me awake. At first, I thought it was part of some lingering dream, but when I opened my eyes, the knocking continued. The unsettling part was that the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside my house. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up, scanning the dark room, but nothing seemed out of place. The only noise now was the faint patter of rain on the windowsill. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. There was nothing. The room felt still, like it was holding its breath. Shaking off the dread, I slowly stood and tiptoed toward the door, making my way downstairs. Every step felt too loud in the oppressive silence. The house was pitch black, the storm having knocked out the power, and I could barely see my hand in front of me. The knocking, it was coming from the kitchen. I hesitated, torn between waking my family or investigating on my own. My mom was on the far side of the house, and my grandparents upstairs. If someone was inside, I'd be putting them at risk. Gripping a bat I'd pulled from the hall closet, I edged toward the kitchen. What I saw next froze me in my tracks. The sliding glass door leading to the backyard, it was wide open. The wind caught it, causing it to sway, but the yard beyond was cloaked in darkness. The knocking had stopped, but in its place came another sound, a soft, dragging noise across the floor. Paralyzed with fear, I stood motionless, unsure of whether to retreat or move forward. Cautiously, I crept closer to the door, but no matter how hard I squinted, I couldn't see anyone outside. For a brief moment, everything was still. Then, just as I thought it was over, I heard a faint whisper, so soft, it barely broke the silence. It seemed to be coming from the porch. I couldn't make out the words, but it felt as though someone was calling my name. My blood ran cold. At that moment, the kitchen felt too dangerous to remain in. I bolted from the room, sprinting to my mother's bedroom. Shaking her awake, I stammered out the details of what happened. She jumped out of bed, and together we searched the house. Everything appeared untouched, just as we'd left it. The sliding door was still open, but there was no sign of an intruder. Nothing seemed out of place, nothing disturbed. And yet, the unease wouldn't leave me. My mother and grandparents chalked it up to a vivid nightmare, but I knew what I'd heard, what I'd seen. That night still lingers in my mind, unsettling and unresolved. Whether it was a figment of my imagination or something far more real, I can't say. But the silence, the whispers, and that open door will haunt me for a long time to come. A year has passed since that unsettling night, yet the memory still lingers, sending a chill down my spine. I was on a solo road trip, spanning from the East Coast all the way to the West, when after hours of relentless driving, I decided to stop for a breather. The gas station I found myself at was isolated, tucked in the middle of nowhere, with the darkness of the late hour, around 11 p.m., if I recall correctly, only adding to the eerie atmosphere. There were barely any signs of life, save for the cashier inside and a few scattered cars in the lot. I went inside, grabbed some snacks, and took a quick trip to the restroom. Everything seemed ordinary until I stepped back outside. That's when I noticed him, standing by the pumps, appearing unkempt and worn down. His beard was scraggly, and his clothes looked like they had seen far better days. Initially, I dismissed him, assuming he was just another traveler. But as I walked toward my car, I felt his gaze burning into me. It sent a wave of unease rippling through me, though I shrugged it off, trying not to overthink things. Settling into my car, I prepared to drive away, but then, in my peripheral vision, I saw him approaching. I tried to act like I hadn't noticed, but he came right up to my window. My heart quickened. He tapped on the glass, and against my better judgment, I cracked the window open just enough to hear him out. He claimed he needed to borrow my phone, saying his car had broken down and he had to call for help. Instinctively, alarm bells rang in my head. Something about the situation felt off. I lied, telling him I didn't have a phone, and began rolling the window up. But he didn't leave. He stood there, his eyes locked on mine, and an icy dread washed over me. He started muttering nonsensical, incoherent words that made my skin crawl. That's when I noticed someone else. Another man emerged from the gas station, looking even more disheveled and wild than the first. His eyes darted around with a manic energy that set every nerve in my body on high alert. It dawned on me in that moment, I was in danger. Without another word, I fired up the engine, muttering a hurried excuse that I couldn't help him. As I drove off, my hands trembling on the wheel, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The two men stood together, talking animatedly, their heads turning in my direction. Whatever they had in mind, I didn't wait around to find out. I sped off into the night, pushing my car as fast as it would go, desperate to put as much distance between them and me as possible. It wasn't until I reached the next town and found a well-lit, more populated area to stop that I began to calm down. But even then, I couldn't shake the heavy feeling that had settled deep in my chest. I knew I had narrowly escaped something terrible that night. The whole ordeal left me rattled, a stark reminder of how quickly things can take a dark turn when you least expect it.